Welcome to everyone, and I am Sciortino, founder and director of SEA-Junction, and I am very pleased to be back with you all for this 27th update, what is happening in Myanmar. As you know, we have started with these updates, first bi-weekly, then monthly since the coup in Myanmar. Now is 2 years after the coup, and we still continue to try to bring attention to the atrocities that are happening in the countries. We do this in different ways, including through exhibition and panel discussion, but also by keeping this series of updates on a regular basis. We are also very pleased to welcome back Debbie Stothard, who doesn't need much introduction, but still she's a famous activist and the founder and director of ALTSEAN, an organization that focuses on Myanmar and ASEAN more generally. This is a collaboration of SEAJunction with AJAR, Indonesia, and AJAR is a human rights organization working in Indonesia, Myanmar, as well as other countries in Asia. So please, Debbie, as usual, you will give first a kind of overview of what has been happening, and then we will open the floor. But before we go to this, I understand you want to show a recent video.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Hi, Rosalia, Leah. We've actually prepared the video, and this is the first time anyone will be seeing it. And it's about it's a short video about the airstrikes in Burma, Myanmar. So, Bon, please share it. So, hi folks, and that was a short video to highlight the fact that we urgently need sanctions on aviation fuel to the illegal junta in Burma, because this junta is losing the war on the ground. Despite having more weapons and more soldiers, local resistance forces are holding them back and are causing a lot of damage to them. And as a result, the Special Advisory Council of Myanmar, SACM, last year reported that up to 52% of the territory in Burma, Myanmar are under control of the resistance. That's the ethnic resistance organizations, People's Defense Forces, and other movements, compared to about 17%. The junta only having stable control of about 15% of the territory. So the junta has resorted to stepping up their airstrikes of 493% increase in airstrikes during 2022 compared to 2021. And this is why, and this is also where the resistance has very little ability to resist. And this is also where civilians are increasingly becoming vulnerable to military violence. I think a lot of people remember the horrific incident a few months ago where there was a helicopter attack on a school in Sagaing, and they could see children running out of the building, but still they bombarded it. So we definitely, and we've also seen the military junta increasingly use domestic, increasingly rely on domestic commercial airlines to actually move troops. So we definitely, definitely need to understand what's going on and recognize that one of the ways to protect civilians in the country is to reduce the junta's ability to launch bombs and missiles and airstrikes from the air on IDPs, on people who are already displaced by violence. So I have a PowerPoint to share with you, and that is, let me share the screen now. You know, we're starting, Leah is starting with us today, our session today, which is really the first catch up online for the year, if I'm not mistaken. So, and we've already seen that, so I just wanted to share, there's no pretty pictures here because the data I'm about to share with you is actually not much of a pretty picture. Firstly, looking back, the military junta started this coup on 1st of February 2021. So we've just finished 2 years of basically what has now amounted to a nationwide civil war. In the past year, there were 10,559 armed clashes and attacks. Armed clashes and attacks against civilians during February 2022 to January 2023, compared to 9,356 during February 2021 to January 2022. And then, of course, a very sharp, much less in the preceding year before, the year before the coup started. So we can see that conflict figures have increased nearly 10-fold. We're talking about nearly 1,000% increase in armed clashes and attacks against civilians. So for those of us who are feeling low energy and a little bit tired, suffering from coup fatigue, let me assure you, this illegal and brutal junta has not gotten tired. They have actually become increasingly brutal and increasingly active in targeting civilians on the ground and resistance forces, because they're panicking, they are losing, and because of that, they're hitting back even harder. The resistance now controls 52% of the territory. And battlefield defeats, losing on the ground, has made the regime increasingly dependent on airstrikes, as I mentioned. And when we look at this, then we start to understand why, for the past year, civil society organizations and human rights groups have been calling for sanctions on the supply of aviation fuel. At the end of this month, only the UK and Canada adopted those sanctions. So, and also what is kind of shocking is that these airstrikes have also involved the junta's aircraft illegally entering the airspace multiple times of Thailand and India and Bangladesh. And so we don't understand why countries are still accepting this. If they don't care about the men, women, and children being killed in Burma, being displaced, being subjected to atrocity crimes, at the very least, they should be thinking about their national sovereignty, their territorial sovereignty. So by late January 2023, that means as late as last week, conflict-related fatalities. So these are not civilians killed, but also all sides in the conflict, fighters and other people. Conflict-related fatalities had reached 31,400 people. And what was very shocking when we looked at these figures, which come from ACLED, the ACLED database, which tracks armed conflicts all over the world, is that this is almost just over, it's pretty much the same figures as Ukraine. Ukraine, at the same time, the number of conflict-related fatalities in the Ukraine that has been invaded by Russia is 31,371. I think when we looked at these figures, we got a very big shock, because obviously the response from the international community has not been anywhere near what the response has been on Ukraine. And people will tell me, oh, under international law, this is one country invading another country. Myanmar is an internal issue, blah, 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 blah. But hello, you look at the impact on the ground. It's the same. It's very, very similar. And the threat to regional security and stability, to economic stability in the region is the same. So, you know, I don't want to hide behind international law and say this is an internal matter, because finally, in the end, if we let these kinds of atrocity crimes happen, once it hits the level of atrocity crimes, it is not an internal matter. This is a serious international crime. One of the things that has happened, and you know, I'm speaking from being involved in a movement for over 30 years as a Malaysian, but you know, being concerned about this, is that, you know, we have never discounted or dismissed the brutality of this junta. Even before the coup, they used rape and sexual violence as a strategy of war, targeting civilians. They did this to the Rohingya, they did this to the Kachin, they did this to the Karen, they did this to the Karen, they did it to very many ethnic nationalities, even before they started this coup. But what has been quite horrifying is that since 2021, we started to notice a horrific trend, which is the junta troops deliberately burning people alive. Men, women, children, older people, people with disabilities, they are being caught and burnt alive in an attempt to horrify and terrorize the local population. So in the past year and a half, we've been receiving reports and documentations of these kinds of incidents happening all over the country, from Sagaing region in the west to Karenni or Kaya state in the east. I think most of you remember on Christmas Eve of 2021, nearly 40 men, women, and children who were displaced by the conflict in Kaya or Karenni state were on their way to go and to another place to spend Christmas with friends and family from another place that was safer. They were escaping persecution, and they were intercepted and detained and burnt alive. That was the Crusoe Christmas Eve massacre. What many people did not realize was a week before, about a week or 10 days before, on the other side of the country, more than 10 people, including 2 teenage boys, had been burnt alive in Sagaing as well. So it's not an accident. And we already talked about how this military has stepped up violence in the past year, more violence, more airstrikes than the year before, and that we've seen a tenfold increase in armed clashes and attacks on civilians since before the coup started. But what we also have to recognize is that over 1.5 million people are already displaced within the country. When we talk about 1.5 million people, this is actually a very conservative figure put out by UN agencies. If you talk to humanitarian groups on the ground, people helping their own communities, they will tell you that this number is too small, that it is an underestimate. And, you know, we're in ASEAN, we're in a region where economic issues are paramount. And so it's important to also understand how the junta's brutality and mismanagement has actually, is actually a threat to regional economic recovery. Just some basic statistics. According to the World Bank and the ADB, according to the multilateral banks, the economy shrank by over 15%. So that means the economy shrank by 15%, but this is not all. It is actually about 24 to 25% behind the rest of Southeast Asia, because the rest of Southeast Asia was growing by 9%, and the Burmese economy has shrunk by 15%. So, you know, governments in this region, whether it's Indonesia, the current chair of ASEAN, whether it's Thailand and other countries, are obsessed with economic recovery, especially to recover from the damage of the COVID pandemic. And they cannot, and they would be blind and outright crazy to think that somehow the shrinkage of Burma's economy is not going to affect their economic recovery, especially when we look at ASEAN's obsession with economic integration. So, you know, people say, as a human rights activist, you're too emotional. What I'm saying to ASEAN governments is, please be logical. If you are logical, you will see that what this junta has been doing, killing its own people and destroying the economy, is a direct threat to your own economic recovery. And don't hide behind wimpy statements not backed by action. Don't think that somehow if you avert your eyes, it will simply go away or resolve itself. 2 years on, it hasn't. You need to have some guts, and you need to have some logic instead of clinging to this desperate hope that you like to have a repressive regime in the region because by default you look so much better, or it gives you license to be even more repressive yourself. It's not going to work. Now, UN OCHA at the end of last year announced that 17.6 million people will need humanitarian assistance this year. And this is 17.6 million people compared to 1 million people in 2021. What we're looking at is 34% of the entire population needing humanitarian assistance and protection. If you don't tell me this is a concern in terms of regional stability and economic recovery, then I don't know what to say. I would be dumbfounded. And the World Bank has already reported that poverty in the country had doubled to 40% of the population. Inflation had risen to 19.4% as of June last year. And while we have to understand that the struggle in Burma, the movement in Burma, and human rights defenders all around this region stand in strong solidarity with the Ukraine, we also have to recognize something. The Myanmar Chat has lost 60% of its value compared to 30% for the Ukrainian hryvnia. So this is something, if you were an economist or you were a person, whether you're in government, a politician, or a decision maker, concerned only saying, I don't care about human rights, I only care about money, 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 well, please wake up. It's money, money, money that is also affected by this coup. And in 2 years, I mean, for goodness sake, they started the coup in 1st of February. It took ASEAN nearly 3 months to get their act together, to get off their butts and actually have a meeting to say, oh dear, what do we do? And come up with a 5-point consensus, which is focused on cessation of conflict and constructive dialogue. But no one mentioned anything specifically about the release of political prisoners, including the government leaders of that time and MPs elect. Now, even if you don't mention the release of political prisoners, how do you have a constructive dialogue if you are launching airstrikes and doing a wholesale arbitrary detention and judicial persecution of people? I mean, you know, we saw last year 2 young women in different parts of the country being sentenced to 7 years jail and 10 years jail because they donated $2, yeah, on their mobile phone app to a suspected PDF, People's Defense Force count. And they got jailed for that amount of time. So, you know, how do you have an environment that is possible for constructive dialogue if you are setting up notorious interrogation centers? So, you know, when I get alerts about friends who have been arrested, and then everyone's calling around saying, what do we do about this person? They are in detention. I said, look, I'm really sorry. It's not possible at this point for an embassy to go and try and find out what happened or to intervene on their behalf. The only thing you can do is to pray that they are released from the interrogation center to jail quickly. Why? Because these interrogation centers have become notorious for all forms of extreme forms of torture, including sexual violence, targeting women and LGBT community. Anyone who's been imprisoned, who's being subjected to interrogation, they're at a very high risk of torture, but particularly women and LGBT community members. So, you know, this is a new phenomenon that we now have these interrogation centers mushrooming all over the country. And yet ASEAN is keeping quiet. And what did the regime do? Min Aung Hlaing said, yes, yes, smile, smile. And then when he got on the plane from Jakarta, he did absolutely the reverse. He stepped up the violence. He stepped up the crackdown. And after dithering, and then civil society, human rights groups were saying, ASEAN, did you notice your 5-point consensus is being treated like toilet paper by this illegal and brutal junta? What the hell are you thinking? Get rid of it, replace it with something that makes sense. After all of this, you know, ASEAN said, no, 5-point consensus, everybody recognizes us. UN Security Council, various international bodies and INGO, intergovernmental organizations said, oh yeah, we support ASEAN to implement the 5-point consensus. And I'm going like, guys, did you actually read it? Have you actually been tracking what's happening? And finally, from April 2021 to November 2022. So we're talking about a year and a half of this ugly mess getting worse and worse. Finally, the ASEAN leader said, oh, I guess we have to have an implementation plan. Okay, so foreign ministers, you draft the implementation plan. That's November. 3 months later, we still haven't seen a peep out of the foreign ministers as to what they're doing with this implementation plan. In December, the UN Security Council finally adopted its first resolution on Burma, demanding an immediate end to all forms of violence. But China and Russia opposed a provision to use coercive powers to ensure compliance. Yeah. So basically, this is yet another toothless statement. The only thing is, we can say at least the Security Council did it. Hopefully, we are able to push forward and try and get some action. So this is where I'm going to stop sharing. This is the bare facts of the situation, and I await your responses, your questions, your comments. What I can say is 2 years on, the resistance is still strong. The resistance has changed how they respond to the situation. We lost a lot of people, but we saw many people, young people, still taking leadership, still organizing flash mobs and online protests. We've seen the CDM, the Civil Defense Movement, the Civil Disobedience Movement still active. We've seen, despite the fact that the junta has treated health workers like public enemy number one, many of these health workers still run alternative public and underground public health systems to help local people. Young people, what has been really inspiring is that young people have refused to join the junta-controlled education system. So as we talk to more people, you will see there are a number of online universities, despite the fact that we have lack of electricity and internet interruptions. Young people are still organizing online universities for each other. And very recently on a border trip, I was so surprised and inspired to see that young people from ethnic backgrounds were also organizing their own short online courses for young people stuck in the country and also based in the border, so that they do not lose their chance at education, but also stay connected to their language and culture. So all around, at every step of the movement, we have seen amazing resistance. We have seen both peaceful and armed resistance taking place. And while people feel at many points of this struggle that they have been abandoned by ASEAN, that they have been abandoned by the international community, they still have been fighting on, and they still depend on our solidarity. So in many respects, the frustration for me, the tragedy for me, is that we have what we were fighting for from the very beginning, a movement and a political commitment to equality and equity. What we don't have is effective, cohesive, and coordinated international support. People on the ground are not just resisting, they are building in their respective spaces alliances, commitments to federalism and human rights. For now, we see people very committed to the idea of accountability, criminal accountability for the crimes, people realizing that ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya, who were the first to be subjected to atrocity crimes, are part of their community as well, acknowledging what's been done to them. I think this is, on one level, the most inspiring development that's happened. But on another level, it feels as though the rest of us in the international community are falling down. And perhaps this is the year that we really need to get our act together to match the energy, the resolve, and the resourcefulness of this movement.
Thank you very much, Debbie. We have quite a lot of questions, so I will start. First, what is your view of Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN? What is your expectation, whether things will change or will remain more or less the same issue? Then about UNHCR and World World Population Fund, no, World Food Fund, I think it is, are driving through NUG controlled area without informing NUG. What can be done about this to make sure that the UN talks to NUG? So there are quite a lot of questions about the international setting and how the various actors play together. A third question for now, we have more, but I will stop here with 3 questions, is people hears question, comment from various donors providing humanitarian assistance to Myanmar about how can the NUG and EAO, the Ethnic Armed Force, cooperate more effectively together.
Thanks for those questions. Of course, after Brunei chairing in 2021 and then Cambodia in 2022, there's a huge amount of expectations that Indonesia, as this year's chair of ASEAN, is going to do better. In fact, they should do better, because I don't know how we could do worse than Brunei, to be honest. And in fairness, Brunei is not used to dealing with situations of conflict. Now, Indonesia sees itself as one of the founding members of ASEAN. It sees itself as the largest democracy in the region, and they need to actually, they have a certain amount of obligation. But having said that, President Jokowi is really concerned about economic recovery. When he hosted the G20 in November, the theme was about recovering stronger together in terms of economic recovery, and even the slogan for Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN for 2023 is ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth. So it's all about growing the economy and saying ASEAN matters economically. But what President Joko Widodo and Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi and the rest of the Indonesian authorities need to understand is that even if they were looking at this situation as from an economic lens, they do need to acknowledge that something more than statements needs to be applied. So the question is, will Indonesia go beyond statements? They have made good statements, but will they actually put into practice the principle, the content, and the spirit of those statements? Having Malaysia Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and President Joko Widodo meeting in Indonesia and saying, yes, we should put more pressure on the junta, you know, sometimes we need to see that in action. And I think there's a lot of hope that Indonesia will use strategically and strategically use its leverage. ASEAN understands, and I think we also need to go back to Mati Natagalewa, the former Indonesian Foreign Minister's interview with Channel News Asia about 2 weeks ago, where he said that the Myanmar crisis was an existential threat to ASEAN, and even suggested that the NUG, the National Unity Government, should be allowed to join or even occupy the Myanmar chair at ASEAN meetings. At the very least, the ban on political representation, which is the ASEAN euphemism of we are not inviting Min Aung Hlaing to the ASEAN summit or ASEAN ministerial meeting, needs to be expanded to all the ASEAN meetings, whether it's the ASEAN Tourism Ministers meeting or the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting. We do need to actually have, we need ASEAN to have policy coherence. If the ASEAN leaders are making this policy for the ASEAN summit, that policy needs to be reflected and implemented and applied to all the other aspects of ASEAN's political meetings. At the very least, they won't lose anything by inviting NUG as an observer to these meetings in the first instance. Because if they don't do that, the junta, Min Aung Hlaing, will feel quite comfortable that whatever happens, whatever he does, however brutal he is, ASEAN will not recognize the other side. And I think when we look at the fact that ASEAN has an obligation through its statements and treaties to uphold democracy, they do need to actually at least allow NUG in the door. Strategically, it will make Min Aung Hlaing wake up and recognize that ASEAN is serious about getting this matter resolved. And if Min Aung Hlaing wants to be respected or at least acknowledged, he needs to be able to deliver on the 5-point consensus. I think Indonesia, as the current chair of ASEAN, has a responsibility for drafting the implementation plan for the 5-point consensus. And that responsibility also includes, in the spirit of constructive dialogue, which is one of the objectives of the 5-point consensus, it should include consultation with and inclusion of the NUG, of civil society and other affected stakeholders in how this implementation should be done, monitored, and assessed. So that's the piece. I think we need to also push hard. ASEAN and Indonesia need to understand that sanctions being applied by different countries and bodies are very important leverage. You can't have only carrot, you need stick. Yeah. So we do need to also have ASEAN needs to tell, or some parts of ASEAN, because now when we talk about existential threat to ASEAN, we're seeing that Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam are ganging up against Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines in terms of how, and they're split over how to handle this crisis. So we do need to have the more progressive elements of ASEAN, the wiser elements of ASEAN, to actually let allies know, hey, sanctions are not a bad thing. At least with a sanction on aviation fuel, this junta's aircraft can't come intruding into our airspace. They can't they can't drop missiles and bombs and do airstrikes on schools and music festivals and IDP camps. You know, so if Indonesia wants to be effective in their diplomacy with the junta, they need to actually bring NUG and the rest of the movement, the NUCC and civil society, into the space so that Min Aung Hlaing recognizes that he has viable competition. Yeah, that's one thing. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and others also need to encourage the US and other actors to impose sanctions on aviation fuel and other types of weapon sanctions so that the junta recognizes that they cannot get away with committing atrocity crimes, that they have to start cooperating with Indonesia as the chair of ASEAN. Otherwise, this might be probably not a wasted year like when Brunei or Cambodia chaired, but it will be a half-wasted year because Indonesia was not willing and not having the courage to actually exercise the leverage, the potential leverage that it has at its disposal. So I think that's going to be important, but you can already see there's already a lot of advocacy. A lot of people are flying into Jakarta and trying to have as many meetings as possible to try and encourage Indonesia to go beyond its natural tendency to conservative diplomacy. Okay, UNHCR World Food Programme, traveling around willy-nilly into NUG and resistance control territory without saying, hello, we're here, hope you don't mind. You know something? This is yet another, when there was so much criticism about INGOs going to sign MOUs with an illegal junta who was actually creating the crisis, People were pissed off, to be honest. But then you add salt to the wound by disrespecting people on the ground, the elected leadership and representation, by disrespecting not just the NUG, but the ethnic organizations who have been performing those functions and trying to get civilian protection. That's outrageous. That's absolutely outrageous. I think the UN and INGOs need to understand this is a country at war. If you want to talk about, if you want to understand that, if you acknowledge that this is a war, then you need to invoke operational principles. The junta is not the government, not now, not ever. You have to deal with the junta as though it is one of many armed organizations in this conflict, which means you also have to treat the NUG and the ethnic resistance organizations with equal respect as you would treat the junta. So I think, you know, when we think, people say, oh, but, you know, the junta is in, you know, we have to get real, we have to be practical, pragmatic, the junta is in control. Hello, the junta is in control of Yangon Airport. It's not even in control of Yangon. Just because you're living in downtown Rangoon, in comfort, and you think, oh, everything's under control. But you need to understand that even in this past month, during the month of January, there were a number of killings and bombings in Yangon region, including in downtown and northern Yangon, the city itself. So don't be blind, don't be silly. And when we think about that and we talk about humanitarian assistance, sometimes it's really amazing. I'm really glad to see that there are friends like Adelina Kamal in the room. Adelina is a regional and international humanitarian expert. And what we all know and what we learned and what we all know is that it is the grassroots organizations who are doing heroic efforts, who've been doing a huge amount of humanitarian work on the ground in places that the UN agencies and the INGOs could not reach or would not reach. And I think if we are talking about a humanitarian coordination, what we need is a willingness by donors to channel resources to these grassroots organizations so they can get the aid effectively across the border. We're not talking about massive convoys. We're talking about how they're doing it consistently in innovative ways without losing resources and while making sure that it reaches the people who need it most. I think this is very important. We cannot assume that border-based aid is only a few 100 meters of the border. A lot of this aid is being sent in many ways as far in as 100 or 200 kilometers further on inland. And when we look at the conflict map, you will see all of these places that are being subjected to routine airstrikes are in the border areas anyway, especially on Chin and Sagaing, on Kachin, Shan, Karen, Karenni. This is where a lot of the violence is happening, and this is where we also need to send that in. And when we look at what's going on too, the junta is trying to cut the flow of money, part of its Four Cuts campaign, and yet people on the ground, including very, very inland, who cannot get the physical supplies, are still getting financial aid using a range of innovative ways so that they can try and purchase the supplies in their local area to help their local people. So there are so many people on the ground, all these unseen heroes who have been working so hard. And very often it is the diaspora that's sending the money in. It's not the big donors. And I think it's time for us to understand in this humanitarian emergency, we cannot talk about the bean counters. about I want a receipt, or I want my organizational logo on the supplies given to those starving children. It's not about that. It's about getting the aid across. And that means you need to be flexible. You need to actually understand how the context in which people work, and you need to find ways for them to be accountable. And this is where I was talking with an old friend the other day. We have to balance the vision and the reality with the bean counters. You know, when we talk about bean counters, it's a slang word for those who are counting every cent, every bean. But we need to understand very many big INGOs are spending huge amounts of money with very little impact, or not with less impact than you will expect. And it's time to be pragmatic and channel those resources to people on the ground who know their community, who know how to deal with their community needs, and who are willing to go that extra mile. I hope that answers all three questions.
Was a question about the perception that NUG could work more closely with the ethnic armed groups.
I think okay, so we are trying to divide what's happened in this past a year or so. We've actually tried to recategorize when we talk about ethnic armed organizations. Ethnic resistance organizations are those ethnic armed organizations that are resisting the coup and the junta. And the ethnic armed organizations are groups that are either pro-junta or who we don't know where they stand. So when we're talking about better coordination between the national unity government and the ethnic resistance organizations, we need to understand that there is coordination. There's always going to be the tyranny of distance, time, and blockages to communication. But we also have to recognize that humanitarian actors on the ground are important to this picture. And while the NUG has been coordinating and also conducting its own humanitarian work, we need to actually have a commitment and policy commitment and financial commitment by donors to recognize that the established groups on the ground also need resourcing. We cannot expect the NUG to do everything. We need to be able to empower community-based organizations and grassroots organizations who are already doing the humanitarian work to work with the NUG and the EROs. I think that's going to be very important. We cannot just think of it as EROs and NUG, but there's a bigger ecosystem, and we need to be more inclusive of that. I think that's going to be important. But you know something? When people complain about that, we also have to say, okay, so who's very coordinated? Oh, yes, the illegal military junta. And what do they do? How do they coordinate? They block humanitarian assistance and they kill more people. Yeah. So who do you want to work with?
Okay, now the last, we still have quite a lot of questions, but time is running fast, so I will just pick two. One is about what is you think is the result, the impact of the Burma Act. So that is one question. And then another question is, now this is related to what you have said about ASEAN and inviting the NUG. The question is how to arrive to that. I mean, how to arrive to ASEAN, because a recent statement from Indonesia is the chair, which by the way, I am much less optimistic than other in this room, about the willingness of Indonesia to really raise to the challenge, but that is another discussion. But the recent statement was that they are not taking sides, choosing one side over the other. This is a very recent statement. So that implies they are not willing to choose NUG at the cost of the junta or the junta at the cost of NUG. At the moment, this is the neutrality that they are just declared after the recent meeting, ASEAN meeting. So how to arrive that indeed ASEAN will invite NUG and will get support, give support to the NUG.
Well, first, the Burma Act finally it's come through. I think we're only going to see the full impact of it in the next few months. But it opens up the space and the opportunity to dedicate resources and certain courses of action. But I would still say that this Burma Act needs to be more actively utilized, and it needs to go, implementation of the Burma Act needs to go in a very particular direction, which is fundamentally resourcing a federal democratic country, the development of a federal democratic country, and that means being able to resource all the processes and all the stakeholders in that mix. But about Indonesia as the chair, Indonesia should not take any side except ASEAN side. And if you are on ASEAN side, you will realize that keeping your hands up in the air and not doing anything and saying, oh, we're being neutral, is not going to serve ASEAN or Indonesia's interests. Because this having a hands-off approach is going to come and bite us on the butt for a very, very long time. Because calling yourself, taking a neutral position basically means enabling the junta to continue its threat to regional stability. That's one thing. Now, what has been quite interesting is that we can see that this invocation of neutrality, saying we don't want to take sides, is firstly a reaction, a knee-jerk reaction to pressure by some of the ASEAN states saying, oh, you've been too critical of the junta. In fact, President Widodo did interviews at the ASEAN Summit last November where he referred to the junta as the junta. He didn't call it the Myanmar authorities. He didn't call it the Myanmar armed forces. He actually used the word junta. So we could already see that would have been quite shocking. And also the junta would be quite worried about how many NUG and pro-democracy stakeholders are flying to Jakarta and trying to engage with the government. Having said that, yes, if we don't have high expectations of the Indonesian government as the chair, we also have to remember that we should have high expectations of people's power in Indonesia. And this is quite important, that the foreign ministry and the government of Indonesia is not going to budge unless there is sufficient domestic pressure as well. Indonesia needs to understand saying we don't want to take sides is not in their interest as the chair of ASEAN. If you really care about ASEAN, you need to take sides now. You need to take the side of the people of ASEAN.
Okay, so let's hope the people of Indonesia will put pressure on their government so that they finally will invite NUG to at least observe at the ASEAN meeting. Now, referring to Timor-Leste, which is waiting for years to be more than an observer, that is not just now is an observer. Of course, that is not a very optimistic view of the future, but let's hope that it will take less in inviting NUG to be part of the discussion in line, like you said, with one of the 5 agreements that were made that they would consult with all the parties. So thank you, Debbie, for for this very enlightening discussion and presentation. We are going to see you next month on the 9th of March. We have already fixed the date exactly after International Women's Day. In between, SEA-Junction will have other activity related to Myanmar, including the second part of the exhibition, stand up always, or something like this. The title now I don't, but it's about standing up and resistance. And this will be on the 21st of February at the Bangkok Arts and Cultural Center on the 3rd floor this time. So please do come and visit, and there will be also a lounge program that we will inform all of you about that. So once more, thank you for participating, and thank you for keeping up the fight for a better Myanmar, hopefully in a near future. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back on March the 9th, and don't forget to go to our website, ALTSEAN.org, because the details of what I was talking about is now, I think, available on our monthly Cool Watch. It should have gone up onto our website in the past few minutes. So thank you so much for having me, Leah.
So also spread the video, and the exhibition title, to be correct, is Never Give Up.
Never give up.
Never give up.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.